In this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the different ways you can use shift queuing to allow different units to perform multiple actions in a row, which was not possible in earlier versions of Age of Empires 2. This new feature allows us to more efficiently direct our attention since we can queue up all actions necessary to complete a task at once. This means no more idle time after a building completes, more efficient resource selection, and much more, which we'll get into in the video. Thanks for tuning in, and let's begin. First up is sheep stacking. In Definitive Edition, dead animals do not block units from walking across them. This means that if you kill a sheep with your villagers under your town center, you can actually send another sheep directly on top of the dead sheep and shift queue the villagers to harvest it next. Since your villagers don't have to move at all when gathering sheep, you can get a much smoother Dark Age. To do this, select your shepherds as well as the live sheep that you want to harvest next, and then while holding shift, right-click the sheep that is currently being harvested and then right-click the live sheep. This will cause the live sheep to move to the center of the dead sheep. Once the shepherds are finished with the dead sheep, they will instantly move on to the next one. You can reduce the walking time while harvesting sheep down to 0 with this technique. Another effective use of shift queuing in the early game is with your lumberjacks. I'm sure anyone who plays Forest Nothing already knows this one, but it can still be useful in real maps like Arabia. Villagers tasked to wood tend to hop to the other side of the camp after finishing a tree, which can lead to them bumping into each other and wasting time. With clever use of shift queuing, you can make sure that villagers won't bump into each other at all. In this test, I only shift queued the villagers on the left side, whereas the right side villagers were tasked to the first tree like normal. As you can see, the villagers on the left don't bump into each other at all, and they never try to loop around the lumber camp. Meanwhile, the ones on the right bump into each other a lot, and they sometimes walk around the lumber camp. This might be lessened without the Aegis cheat on, but it will still not be as good as the other side. In the end, the left side villagers gathered considerably more wood than the right side. Hunters also benefit from shift queuing. Sometimes, your hunters won't take all the same deer once they've finished the first one. If you queue them to the deer you'd like to take in order, they can be much more efficient. Oftentimes, once there are no more deer, your villagers will stay idle for a while until you notice it. If you shift queue after the last deer, you can send them to wood or another resource so they don't go idle for even a second. Speaking of deer, laming deer is a lot easier with shift queuing as well, since you can just tell your unit to kill all the deer at once. This can be useful if you have an extra militia or man-at-arms left over after a drush. Some maps spawn resources behind wood lines that are inaccessible. This is fairly common on Black Forest, but it can still happen even on open maps like Arabia. It's now much easier to chop the correct trees to unlock your resources. Remember, you can queue up buildings as part of the action chain, so if you have an extra 100 wood to spare, you can get your villagers to immediately take the hidden resources after chopping through to them. Since we know that we can queue up building commands, what does that mean for walling? Oftentimes, once you've completed a section of wall, your villager will stay idle. With shift queuing, we can get a villager to fully wall and then walk back to resources. As you can see, if you drag a wall, only the first piece will be waypointed. This will cause the villager to complete the first wall piece and then move on to the next queued action, which in this case is woodcutting. Instead, drag the wall and then while holding shift, right-click each individual wall piece to add it to the action queue. This will allow you to fully wall and then send the villager back to work. You have to be careful with sending villagers that are already tasked to a resource to build a building. If you hold shift when placing a building while the villager is collecting resource, they'll wait until they completely deplete the resource before building. Make sure to not hold shift when placing the first building in a chain. It's also exceedingly useful to tell monks to pick up and bring back relics automatically. Since you always want to bring a relic somewhere after picking it up, you should always be shift queuing monks if you have time, since it's easy to forget your monks while you're doing other things. Now, moving on from the economy. There are a few tricks you can use for tower rushing or defense. Firstly, you can queue repairers to garrison after they're finished repairing. You can't queue a garrison for builders though, since garrison is an invalid action on an unfinished tower. If you're tower rushing, you can queue villagers to attack a wall, then build a tower afterwards. Be careful though, if a villager can't do an action, he'll move on to the next one, and if he can't do that one, he'll go idle. In most cases, it's probably best to just watch your villagers, but maybe this can come in handy once in a while. Shift queuing can also be used for raiding. If your opponent has defense at the front of his base and you know of a safer way to get in, you can tell your raiding party to follow the safer route. Unfortunately, you can't queue up multiple waypoints on buildings, so you have to control your units manually each time you want to send in a raid. One idea that could have a lot of potential is choosing the target order for units. In this test, you can see that I tell the skirmisher in which order to hit the archers. This works great when you only have one unit selected, but things fall apart when you have multiple units. As you can see, the skirmishers only attack the conquistador that I selected last. They can only take one attack action in the queue. It would be pretty OP if you could queue up attack actions, since you could get your skirmishers to snipe important units much easier in larger battles. This is probably for the best. You also can't queue attack commands for offensive buildings like castles and towers. I did, however, discover something very interesting when testing this. It turns out that if you spam click units that are behind rams, there's a high chance that your castle will automatically target the other units that are behind the rams for a while. It's like the castle forgets that it should be targeting the closest enemy to it. You don't need to hold shift for this trick, and spamming more clicks seems to make the castle forget about the rams for longer. This could give you enough time to send units to destroy the rams, or it might be enough to make your opponent pull back some of his military units. Be careful though, the castle will eventually target the rams again. So what if we want to cut our way through some trees to our opponent's base? If you select multiple siege onagers, the behavior is the same as what we saw when selecting multiple skirmishers in the last test. The onagers only attack the last selected option and don't even add the other actions to the queue. Luckily, when selecting a single onager, the behavior is also the same as the single skirmisher, and we can tell it to make a path with just a few actions. Cutting through trees used to be pretty attention heavy, but now you can just set a few actions and come back later to see the forest completely destroyed. Can you queue attack ground, you might say, for some reason? And the answer is no. It seems that military units behave in mostly the same way as each other. When you have one selected, you can queue up multiple attack commands, but when you have multiple selected, you can only queue up a single attack command. This is very useful for rams, where it can be worth your extra actions to queue up an attack path for at least a few of them. Rams do have a tendency to get stuck, so giving them the extra attention can make them much stronger. Now, there is a unit that is a bit of an exception, Trebuchets. If you select a single Treb and queue up actions while it's still packed, it'll carry out the attack order properly. But if you try to queue up actions while it's unpacking, it'll only hit the first building and then the last building. Even stranger, when you try to shift queue a fully unpacked Trebuchet, it will act like you have multiple units selected and try to retarget the last thing you clicked. There's one last thing I'd like to cover. How are villagers' combat abilities affected by shift queuing? I'd say they got a huge buff. You still have to click each individual target that you want to attack, but you can do it all at once, so you can focus on other things once it's done. You can see here that the villagers instantly move on to the next ram, which makes the difference between the castle being destroyed and not. In summary, you can generally shift queue single units to make multiple actions, but when you have multiple units selected, you can only queue up one action. Villagers always act like there's only one selected, meaning you can always queue up multiple actions even with multiple villagers selected. And Trebs are weird. So who knows, maybe we'll finally see Spanish supremacy villagers with sappers as late game siege units. Or maybe we might not see much change at all. This has been Survivalist, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the ladder.